This morning's airstrikes were in Gaza City, previously conquered by Israeli forces. The target was Hamas, but dozens of Palestinians were reported killed. And through the dust, this much is becoming clear. Many Israeli generals are unhappy with the official strategy of total victory, preferring a ceasefire to bring their hostages home. Yesterday, the Red Cross counted 22 dead at one of its field hospitals, most of them women and children displaced by the fighting and living in tents. Though Israel described its operation as precise and based on intelligence, several commanders want to reduce the violence, and one has even gone public on the absence of a plan for when the war ends.
This business of destroying Hamas, making Hamas disappear, it's simply throwing sand in the eyes of the public. If we don't bring something else to Gaza, then at the end of the day, we will get Hamas.
Such a rift between a prime minister and his generals is unusual in wartime, with Mr. Netanyahu even refusing to endorse a peace plan drawn up with help from his own officials. He's also risked a widening rift with Washington, causing his closest allies, the Americans, offence by saying what his coalition partners want to hear.
It's inconceivable that in the past few months, the administration has been withholding weapons and ammunition to Israel. Israel, America's closest ally, fighting for its life, fighting against Iran and our other common enemies.
Some Israeli generals want to switch focus to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and several targets have been bombed in the last few days. The militants are backed by Iran, and for the first time they have released drone footage of military sites deep inside Israeli territory, including this base in Haifa. Hezbollah's leader, Sheikh Nasrallah, claims they have hours of footage and that nowhere will be safe from drone attack if it comes to all-out war. And that's left this man pleading for the strikes and counterstrikes to stop.
One miscalculation could trigger a catastrophe that goes far beyond the border and, frankly, beyond imagination. Let's be clear. The people of the region and the people of the world cannot afford Lebanon to become another Gaza.
This afternoon, the Israelis said they had attacked this car in Lebanon, carrying what they said was an arms supplier working for Hamas. And as they did for this Gaza operation, the Americans are pledging their full support for Israel as it weighs up the possibility of another war.
Well, Shashank Joshi is defence editor at The Economist. Earlier I asked him whether he thought there would be an escalation in the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah.
The rockets and drones are flying thick and fast across that northern Israeli border. So this situation is worsening. And I think in Israel, there is a real sense that at some stage it may become necessary to go to war against Hezbollah if these 60,000 Israelis displaced from the north are to be able to get back to their homes and get on with their lives. So I think that's a serious risk of conflict growing by the day.
The question our viewers will be wondering is, given what's been said by Israel, they're talking about all-out war, and Hezbollah is talking about a war with no restraints. Do you think a war of that proportion is a possibility?
It's absolutely a possibility. And the reason is that even if Israel confines itself to the south, Hezbollah would have a very powerful incentive to use its longer range missiles against the entirety of Israel as a retaliatory measure. And of course, that would immediately provoke a much broader Israeli campaign.
The UN Secretary General has warned this week of the danger of Lebanon turning into another Gaza. And we know how horrific the situation is there. Could it be that bad?
Well, if you look at that 2006 war I mentioned, it was devastating in humanitarian terms. It did profound damage to Beirut's infrastructure, to its residential neighborhoods, and of course to southern Lebanon, where villages and communities were hit very hard indeed. And what's worth remembering is that Hezbollah's rocket arsenal in the other direction is far bigger and more capable than anything Hamas can bring to bear. And of course, Israel would need American assistance to avoid its air defenses and missile defenses being swamped by that sort of barrage. So this could absolutely be a really devastating campaign. It isn't inevitable. There are still intense diplomatic efforts by America's government, by the French, by others, to try to intercede with Hezbollah to get them to pull away from the border and to reduce the level of cross-border firing on both sides.
You mentioned America, Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, talking about support for Israel in terms of what's going on with Hezbollah. Behind the scenes, do you think they'll be straining to avoid this eventuality?
I think all outside powers, including America, are desperate to avoid Israel launching a war like this on Lebanon. And I think the Americans are in a bit of a bind because they realize if a war begins and Hezbollah fires back in force, they may feel they have little choice but to defend Israel. But I think Joe Biden will also realize the last thing he needs months before a US presidential election that is on a knife edge is another major conflict in the Middle East. It could cause Hezbollah's ally Iran to be dragged in as well. I think the Americans are absolutely dead set against this. Well, the question is, can they really dissuade Israel?
You mentioned Iran. I mean, to what extent is Iran really calling the shots here? And what appetite is there within Iran for this kind of war?
I don't think Iran is calling the shots. I think Hezbollah, although it's a very close ally of Iran and was nurtured by Iran 30, 40 years ago, it doesn't do everything Iran says. I think it is firing into Israel in part because it sees the need to stand with the people of Gaza, in Hezbollah's view. But I don't think it is itching for a big conflict. And I think Iran, of course, which has just lost its president in a helicopter crash, Iran is going through an election. I don't think Iran wants a major campaign, not least because if Hezbollah were to receive a bloody nose and Iran didn't intercede, then that would damage the prestige and reputation of Tehran.
The situation internally in Israel means that Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking at public opinion within Israel, isn't he?
He is, but I think it is important to realize here, this is not just a sort of fringe view that is held by Benjamin Netanyahu or his Likud party, or indeed the far-right extremists in power who are propping up his government. This is also, I think, a sense that Hezbollah has to be dealt with that goes much beyond Bibi, that actually is held by senior members of the security establishment, the IDF, and indeed much of the public. So I think it's important to know this will be a real sense of national pressure on the government, not just a sense of parochial right-wing constituencies clamoring for this.
Shashank Joshi, thank you so much for that assessment.
Thank you.